Good evening and welcome on behalf of the New York Society Library. I am Sarah Holliday, the library's head of events, and it's my pleasure to briefly introduce tonight's speaker. Russell Shorto's widely acclaimed titles include The Island at the Center of the World, Amsterdam, A History of the World's Most Liberal City, and Revolution Song, A Story of American Freedom. His books have been published in 14 languages and have won numerous awards, including the library's own 2004 New York City Book Award. We've also been fortunate to have him lecture for us before on that book and on Revolution Song in 2018. His many other honors include a knighthood from the Dutch government for advancing Dutch-American historical awareness and membership in the New York State Writers Hall of Fame. Do please add your comments and questions in the chat on the right side of your screen, as some folks are already doing, and Mr. Shorto will address them following the main presentation. I would now like to yield the online microphone to Russell Shorto.
Thank you, Sarah. It's working?
Perfect.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you very much to everyone who's tuning in. And thank you to the New York Society Library for hosting me. I was just thinking that before, the third time, I think.
I think the third, yeah.
Yeah. And I was honored to receive the award in 2004. So it's great to be here. And I am happy to, do you want to do this in the form of kind of Q&A back and forth, or? I mean, I can just talk a little bit about the book initially.
If you wanted to maybe say a few words, and then I have some questions about how it came to be.
Yeah, well, as one might gather from what we were saying about my books, I write narrative history. And to me, narrative means storytelling about the past, telling true stories about the past. And up until now, they have been, by and large, stories set way back. The Dutch founding of New York, the American Revolution, the founding of Amsterdam, starting in the Middle Ages in the Low Country of Europe. And I had never thought to do something quite this recent in time, nor had I thought to do something so personal. And what happened was several years ago, well, let me back up. I think most people probably have things in their childhood. There were family stories, family secrets, things that nobody's supposed to talk about. And yet kids just kind of absorb it anyway. You pick up, you know about it. So I knew that my grandfather was some kind of mob figure in the town. But I also knew that we don't talk about it. And I was an obedient son. And so I just kind of walled that off. Periodically, you would see adults kind of say something and snicker or whatever. But I really walled it off. And then several years ago, so it's my father's father that I'm talking about. And by the way, I was named after him. My mother's cousin, who I later learned had been a numbers runner for him and worked in the pool hall, he came home for Christmas. He had left town, moved to Las Vegas. It was perfect, by the way, that you set us up with Dean Martin. So Frank is his name. Left town, moved to Las Vegas, was there for many decades. He still does play stand-up bass, and he sings Volare. He could sing the whole song. And he retired and moved back home. And I was home over Christmas, and a group of us said, well, let's go down. He was playing at a local club. So we went down to see him. I didn't know him very well. And in a break between sets, we're all standing around, and these are all mostly older relatives who still live in town, who always stayed in town. And that meant that they kept this we don't talk about that subject vibe. But Frank had left so long ago. To him, these were just golden memories. So there's a break in the set, and he looks at me and he kind of does this, and he says, "Russell, you're the writer. What are we going to do about the story?" And I said, "What story?" And even as I was saying it, I knew what he meant. And he said, "Your grandfather, the mob." And I could feel everybody else just kind of shrinking, because they just didn't, you didn't voice that. So he's the one that got me going. And it was not very long after he kind of burst that bubble that I thought, this is indeed history. I write history. I write narrative history. I'd like a good, solid story. This is a good, solid story. Why haven't I thought of this? Because, I was kind of taught not to. The next step was, I said it to Frank, well, that might be a good idea, but I write nonfiction. I don't want to make things up. Those guys are long gone, and I know perfectly well they didn't keep notebooks. So what am I going to base this on? I was living in Amsterdam at the time, and he said, when you get serious about it, let me know and I'll help you out. So it stayed with me, and I kept pondering it for I'd say maybe 2 years, and then I just decided I was going to explore it. So I decided I would go home for a week just to look into this. And I called him up, and he said, meet me at my hangout, which was Panera Bread, which is kind of perfect. So I met him, and I turned on my recorder just kind of as instinctually, and I thought he was just going to tell me some stories. A little old guy came up, another one. Soon there were like 8 guys around, and they're like leaning on canes and things. 4 hours later, I hit stop, and I said, okay, this is something. These guys have a lot. And that was the beginning of, I think I ended up doing something like 250 hours of interviews with people. But even that, I felt, there's that part of my brain that says, oh, but it's not a good idea because, or this won't work because. And that part of my brain said that, thinking, well, these are old people's stories, and they've, who knows what the facts are beneath them. This happened decades ago. In order to test that, I began the other level of research, which is what I'm most comfortable with, what I'm used to doing, which is going to libraries. My father was friends with the chief of police in town, and he gave me my own key to the police records room. I went to the county courthouse, and I filed Freedom of Information Acts with requests with the FBI, and slowly built this mountain of, documentary evidence, and put the two together. And as I put the two together, I saw that, yeah, these things fit. I mean, this guy's telling me this story, and here I see in the newspaper from that day, it's reported. So slowly then I kind of backed into committing to this as a book project.
That's fascinating, and particularly the evocative difference between writing your previous histories, which no doubt had primary and secondary sources, but writing this history where some of the primary sources were actually living people.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about what surprised you in the sources you found, either the primary or documentary or?
Well, there's so much that surprised me because since I had grown up with this quasi-awareness of my grandfather's history, I always avoided mob topics, the Godfather films, all that stuff. So I had a lot to learn. And so I was surprised by a lot. And one thing was the extent of the small town mob in America. We think of New York and Chicago, but it was everywhere. Mm-hmm. It was in Schenectady, in Utica, in Amarillo, just in Western Pennsylvania, where I'm from, Johnstown, Altoona, McKeesport, Braddock, Monessen, New Kensington, and Pittsburgh, of course. So the extent of it and how they interacted with each other was really a network. And I started to feel like this is another way to tell the story of America in the 20th century almost. It was so pervasive, and it was really a variant of the American immigrant story, watching people come from the old country to America and then kind of fan out in this way. So it was a new way of looking at American history almost.
That was very much something that surprised me too when I started learning a little bit about this, because I also associate mob history very much with urban center history, and it took a little adjusting to think of it as, medium-sized or even small town history. Can you talk a little bit more about what function the mob actually served, or what activities they were involved in a place like Johnstown? I mean, for instance, the supply of jukeboxes and vending machines, which I know applied in a lot of places, it's something people might not be aware of.
Yeah. It first of all, as I said, it's really a facet of the American immigrant story. Going all the way back, you've got these waves of immigrants from southern Italy coming to America, about 4 million. And they came legally. They were answering calls for work, initially. And there's a funny overlap where you have the end of the Civil War. And so these former slave owners cannot rely on slave labor. And that coincides with unification in Italy, when Italy became a nation state. And the North always had this kind of antipathy toward the South in Italy. And strangely, from the moment of Italian unification, that worsened, and the poverty in southern Italy worsened. So all these people are desperate to escape. They end up coming and taking jobs in plantations, and then after that, especially in coal mines. And that's why a lot of places like Johnstown have fairly high concentrations of Italians, because they were the coal mines were all around those regions. So that's what happened in my family. My grandfather's father, his parents, immigrated, and they were first in Punxsutawney, Pennsylvania, and then they ended up in Johnstown. And now I forgot what your question was.
Can you talk a little bit more about what the mob actually did in a place?
Yeah. Okay. Yes. Right. So the first thing they did was, because these are people who were barred from most aspects of society. They weren't going to go to college. They weren't going to get good jobs. And then here's prohibition. So the first kind of the pre-mafia forms around prohibition to supply this product that everybody wanted, which was suddenly illegal. And my grandfather, his trajectory really follows that of the mob in general. He was a kid selling Coke bottles filled with moonshine on the streets, and working for a neighborhood figure who was organizing people to do this kind of activity. He grows up in that, and while he's growing up, he's learning gambling and cards and dice from these people. And then once prohibition ends, he, like people all over the country, shifted the incomes, the source of revenue, from alcohol to gambling. Gambling was, it's hard to imagine how frowned on it was, how there was this heavy moralistic overtone about it. So their core business was providing gambling services. The center of the operation was a numbers game that they called the GI Bank, and I think that they did that for this, out of patriotic, trying to appeal to, because it really came into its own during World War II, and so the idea of these returning troops after the war, you're supporting them somehow. So a numbers game, which half the town played. They had about 100 people employed just in that. They did, there was something at that time called tip seals, which were extremely popular. It was kind of like a lottery where you paid a dime or a dollar, and you got a ticket with a number on it, and you tore that off. And if the number underneath matched your number, then you won whatever the stakes were. Pinball machines were very big, and they owned a pinball machine company. Pinball was, you were able to gamble on it by, and pinball was a remarkable statistic I learned. At one point, more money was generated by pinball than by the movie industry, which, gives you a sense of how, popular it was, and how this was really, people were just hungry for entertainment. And this is largely in the days before television. So pinball, you would, once they had flippers. Before that, you just put your money in and the ball wound around and it did what it was going to do. But once you had flippers, that gave you this feeling that you could control it. And when you win you would win free games in pinball. And the idea was when you had racked up enough free games, you would go up to the bartender or the cafe owner or whoever, and they were in on the deal. And, 10 free games, you won $10 or 10 quarters or whatever. And then the house would split that take with the guys, with the boys. And the beauty of it was that there was no product, there was no like packs of chewing gum or dolls or something that the IRS could say, that's a thing that has to be taxed. Where did it go? Why didn't you pay the tax on it? So pinball was very big. So they had a whole array of things. They had card games for the big shots in town where the pots could be like $10,000, which was an awful lot of money then. Craps games. And then over time, they bought their way into other businesses. So you have a pinball machine and you can't make your rent. Well, they would make the rent for you, and eventually they'd own a piece of the business. So, you spread yourself around town that way. And they made this all happen by paying off the authorities. The mayor, the center of their operation was a place called City Cigar, which was a cigar shop in front, and behind that was a pool hall, and it was 2 doors from City Hall. And so the mayor came over every day, and he would presumably take his envelope, and they paid off the cops, and that allowed for this, blanket of acceptability, so that they really pretty much functioned in the open. And this was, again, it was like that all over the country.
And it sounds to me, informally anyway, like it actually functioned pretty well. I mean, certainly there were problematic, violent, et cetera, aspects, but a lot of the time this all operated smoothly, and it did actually provide stuff that people wanted, right? So there's a kind of...
It was a public service, and everybody I interviewed in town who was over a certain age, who lived through the period, they all knew all of it. They knew Russ and Little Joe, and they knew City Cigar. They knew what went on there. They knew that upstairs was their office where they, the bookies brought everything, and they knew how it functioned because it was in the open, and it was, people saw it. And the funny thing is, so many people who I interviewed told me in one way or another that they admired my grandfather. They looked up to him. They thought that these guys were somehow on their side, that they were for the little guys. And maybe this is a thing that's a little different. There were several interesting ways in which the small town mob seemed to be different from big cities. One, there was less violence. And I think that was by virtue of the fact that in a small town couldn't handle it. I mean, if you started murdering people, people would freak out. The authorities would have to crack down. Then you would lose this whole little, this situation where everything can operate in the open. So you had these ways in which it was kind of different from big cities.
Yeah. Well, and that does strike me as being really, you say, the American immigrant story, a different way of looking at American history, but admiring people's enterprise and feeling like they're there for the little guy. That seems deeply American to me too. I mean,
and since you put it that way, another thing that really surprised me, not just about what happened in my town, but at the mob in general, was how these men, so you had the generation, the people that came from Italy, and that, as in the case of my great-grandparents, they lived in a company town, and they were told what to do and where to shop, and their lives were very regulated. Eventually, though, then they start to have children, and their children are going to American schools, and they are learning to admire George Washington, and they're learning to admire people like Henry Ford and Mellon and Carnegie and the Astor and the men who built America. And there is a remarkable sense in which when they were putting this thing together, they were emulating American titans of industry who, it was pretty well known that how they bribed politicians, they bribed congressmen, they did what they needed to get their way to forge ahead in the steel industry or whatever, shipbuilding. And that's what they did. That's what these guys did. In small towns and large, they bribed the authorities, they manipulated political races, and people, and the amazing thing to me overall about America is that people still admire that kind of guts, that kind of he was able to bend society, bend the government to his will. And without naming names, I think we've seen that in politicians recently, that people admire them for essentially acting like mobsters.
Yeah, for being clever enough to game the system, perhaps.
Right,
Another
right,
thing.
right.
Someone points out in the chat, and thus they were called robber barons, the people like.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, this is a known thing, and the extent to which they, I mean, even, what does a corporation do? It opens branch offices. So the way things happened in Johnstown was my grandfather, as I described, he was homegrown, grew up kind of on the streets, he eventually became, this small town mob figure, but kind of his real passion, I think, was in cheating. He was a natural cheat. He was really good at cheating at cards and dice. So he'd learned the town from that level. Meanwhile, a guy from Philadelphia was assigned the job of opening a branch office in Johnstown. So he brings the imprimatur, he brings the franchise. He meets and then marries a girl who happens to be my grandfather's sister. So that's how they come together. And my grandfather knows the town at that level. And they together proceeded to create this little empire. And that's, again, kind of copying. And his partner, Little Joe, he had two aliases that he used, Ford and Forbes, which to me just speaks to, the way he, they admired these guys, and they were trying to be like them.
Yeah, very much so. So this is based in Johnstown, PA. Someone has noted in the chat that they're originally from there, so that's cool too. Can you talk a little bit about the life of Johnstown as a town? It was thriving as an industrial center, I understand, in the mid 20th century, but I've driven through it since then. I know it's changed somewhat during your lifetime. Can you speak a little bit about the life?
Yeah, it's a classic Rust Belt town. It was it grew up around coal and steel, and for a while it was the big steel place, and then Pittsburgh exceeded it. And it was, they called it, when it was in its heyday, they called it Little Chicago. And that was why the mob was attracted to it, because not because there was money in the sense that it was, people had mansions, but because, as we all know, in early mid 20th century America, you could have a job working in a steel mill and have a wife and kids and own your own home and have a nice car and buy these new appliances that were coming out. So people had good jobs and they had spending money, and that's what the mob relied on, and to provide its services. It needed customers.
Well, again, similar to somebody like Henry Ford, right? People have got to make a decent wage so they can buy his cars, and
exactly, yeah,
the system works. So you told us the great story about how this particular book came to be and why it's different in being a family and local story compared to your other books. Can you talk a little bit about what's similar and different in writing, picking the words and the structure for a family or local story compared to writing about your broader historical topics?
I've become a big kind of believer in family history while working on this book. And I've talked to a lot of forums in the 2 weeks since the book's been out about it, because I feel like I've grown so much by virtue of exploring my family's story. And I think, well, surely other people can do this as well. I was working on the book. I was doing the research when I was asked to be a writer in residence at Baruch College in New York. And so I made my writing workshop family history. And it got a lot of interest. The students were great. And afterwards, the woman who ran the program said, I think you're onto something here with Ancestry.com and all of these kinds of things. So I kept at it, and I created an online course called TellYourFamilyStory.com. And so now I'm doing that kind of as people tune into the course. And then afterwards, we'll exchange emails and talk about their story. And I find that there is a lot of commonality between all kinds of family projects once you get into it. And my case was very typical, not in the sense necessarily that everybody has a mobster in their background, but that you think you grow up with a certain idea about your family's past, about a particular person in the family's past. And if and when you decide that you're really going to explore it officially, as you start digging, you start to think, wait, that doesn't fit. That image I have of the past, that's not, there's something happening, it's breaking down. And typically, often you find that it's, in fact, completely the opposite is true. So it's really the act of reaching another level of maturity, because the stories often were packaged for us when we were children. And I think a lot of people, if you're fine with that, then good for you. It lasts you, it does what you need it to do. But at a certain point, for a lot of people, you get you start to feel that that's not enough. I had one of my students decided he was going to write about his grandparents. He said his parents had a terrible relationship. They divorced. It was very traumatic for him. But his grandparents had this to him, model love affair that lasted for decades, and that's he was going to write about. So he starts to explore it, and as he gets further into it, journals, letters, interviewing family members, he slowly discovers that they basically hated each other. That his grandmother was from Cuba, his grandfather, I think, was from Norway. So very different cultures, and this love story was that he had been fed was that these people come together. In reality, it was like she was, he couldn't stand her kind of hot-blooded, Latin Caribbean personality, and she felt repressed by his cold Nordic. So as you start to unpack it, so this student would, like at first you're bewildered, but as time goes by, you start to grow with it. You start to realize that why they presented the story that way and why you needed it to be that way, and then you can move through that into something else. That's the idea anyway.
That's fascinating. So I did pop in the chat the link to Mr. Shorto's online course about TellYourFamilyStory.com. And I know that is a constant interest with a lot of our library patrons. We have a lot of Ancestry users and people who use our not precisely genealogical resources, but resources on how to research that kind of thing. Is there a quick tip or two you could share with people who are interested in that area?
About doing family history? Yeah, well, first of all, steel yourself, get ready for the ride. It's really useful to tell people who you in your family who you want to get information out of that you're doing a project. Structure it as a serious project that you're doing, because doing that changes your relationships to them. If you are a young guy and you want to interview your aunt or your great aunt about her life, if you're someone else, if you're now a professional interviewer, she might start to open up more. She might tell you about some torrid love affair that she had that she wouldn't maybe be so inclined to tell her nephew about. But so making it professional helps everyone to open up, and it forces people onto new tracks, new ways of thinking about the past. In the course, I give lists of ordinary questions to ask people, because, you know, when you're interviewing people about the past, about the distant past, you're really trying to trick the mind into getting back there. You know, I mean, you can't, rarely can you say, well, tell me about that day in 1952, and, you know, and it'll all come spilling out. So what you want them to do is you want to trick them into like roaming around in that year when they were in 6th grade or whatever it is. And then one thing leads to another, and you're starting to piece something together.
That's very cool. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat that I thought I might toss in here, and we can kind of circle around to whatever else you'd like to include. Anybody else who's attending, thoughts, questions about family history, about Smalltime, about Johnstown, any of those things, please do throw them in the chat. So one of our participants asks, when and where was the first meeting with Frank who prompted you to write the book? He was performing, right?
At Panera Bread, and that was, I think, in probably 2012. You know, these things take a while to germinate, and for me in this case, for me to decide that, yes, I wanted to commit to it. And Frank is still going, and he's probably 85, 86, and he is on forced hiatus, as so many of us are right now, but he's still playing in clubs around town. That's
great. So a couple of people mentioned other things that the mob, at least in other places, was into. Did small town mobs run prostitution, loansharking, and drugs, which obviously larger city ones are famous for?
Sure. That's, I think, another, you know, I haven't done I'm not truly a scholar of the mob, although I've spent a lot of time with them lately. I think in general, that seems to be a difference between small towns and big cities. Everybody told me in town who I interviewed, and including people who worked for my grandfather, that he and his partner, his brother-in-law, would absolutely not tolerate drugs, and they were not involved in prostitution. And I found no evidence that they were. So I'm inclined to believe that, and that in the latter part of this story, then drugs are becoming more and more of a factor in town. And I think that's also one reason why they're, in a way, being pushed aside, because they're selling a product that is, they're not kind of keeping up with the times. I don't know how prevalent that was, if other places readily, you know, adopted these other income streams or not, but that's kind of the way it went with them.
Interesting. And what about anti-union work by the mob? That may have been.
Somebody, you mentioned loansharking. You know, there's a whole interesting. So many people told me, you know, your grandfather put my kid through college or something like that. You know, so there was, but it was very. Everybody said it was very informal. You know, they would just hand you a stack of bills, and you would go off on your way, and they wouldn't say, you know, we want paid back by this time. You just figured, I assume, that you'd better pay it back, and you would come back to them and, you know, work out the deals or whatever. But it was all very informal, and again, I think that reinforced this notion that you know, they're somehow on our side, even though for the most part they were making money for themselves.
Mm-hmm. But workers' unions in particular, friendly.
Were they? Yeah, they were friendly, financially friendly with unions in town, and especially with the Democratic Party. Although they played both sides. My dad remembered the head of the Democratic Party and the head of the Republican Party coming over to the house and having dinner, and his mother making spaghetti for them and all that. And those two, by the way, the heads of the two parties in the county were friends with each other. So that shows you that was a different era altogether.
Yeah, that's kind of refreshing, I guess. Elizabeth Winthrop, who's a distinguished author also, is with us this evening and mentions in the chat, I'm just going to quote this, if you don't mind. I've just completed a memoir based on family history, and I found one of the best parts was capturing my mother's story before I lost her to dementia. As Mr. Shorto warns, I learned details and stories that surprised me and my 5 brothers. It can be a wild ride.
That's exactly it. Oh, that's so nice, Elizabeth. Thanks for saying that. And that's, and I spent so much time when I was a kid with my grandmother. So we haven't gotten into too much of the story in the book of my grandfather, and it was very, very how much havoc he wrought within the family. But eventually, the family forced him out. They kind of ostracized him, and I spent a lot of time when I was young with my grandmother. And while I was working on this, I was just kicking myself, like, I, I could have spent so much time interviewing her, asking her side of all of this, and with so many people who are gone. But, that's always the case with history. So I guess my message there is work with what you've got now and get out there and get it. And that's what, I was surprised. As I started going to more and more people in town and telling them what I was doing, I thought I would get a lot of pushback, like, oh, we have the omerta, the code of silence or whatever. Very little of that. Mostly what I got was this feeling from people that, they were part of something, and that's all going to die. It's all going to go away. So let's get that down. Let's get it, that side of the story down. And a number of people told me too that they were very curious with what I was going to come up with, because especially with a subject like this, everybody has their own window onto it, So they didn't necessarily know the whole story. And there's a Facebook group on Johnstown history, and they are just going wild now with all of these different, people reading the book and adding all new insights. And I'm getting emails from people who are now telling me, there's a murder at the center of the book. I've gotten several emails from people giving me, because it's never been solved, giving me whole new accounts of how this bookie may have been murdered. So, I could probably write another edition, but before it's all over.
Or a mystery novel, or a choose your own adventure novel with
right.
various conspiracy theories. That's fantastic. Or maybe not conspiracy, but alternate theories. So I hope this is not too personal a question, but your name is Russell Shorto, and this was also your grandfather's name. Do you think that was a help, a hindrance? Was it eerie working with his history?
It was an odd thing, and I guess it was part of why I resisted exploring this story, and also why I ultimately dove into it. I was named after him, and it's a Sicilian tradition that when you have kids, if you're the firstborn son, then you name your child after your first son, after your father. So my father named me after him, and he in turn was named after a relative and in Sicily, and his name was originally Rosario Sciotto, Sciotto, and it was Americanized, which again, so many parts of this story are, this is an Italian story, but really it's just an American immigrant story. It has its own twists, but it's just a variation on the theme.
So a question in the chat. I remember reading the book by David McCullough about the Johnstown Flood, which I admit is the word that comes to my mind when you say Johnstown also.
Yeah.
Was your family in Johnstown affected by that event in 1889, or did that predate them?
Yeah, that predated them. They came, as I write about in the book, from Sicily right about 1900. Before that, it was really a kind of a WASP area, WASP town. And then you progressively have these more and more immigrant groups, Italians, but also Poles and Hungarians, and mostly overwhelmingly Catholic. And that then, not just in Johnstown, but in the country, feeds into this great wave of anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic sentiment in the country, and a resurgence of the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan, which, of course, had come into being originally after the Civil War, and then all but died out, but came back with a vengeance then. And you had these parades down, the streets in Washington, D.C. and in Johnstown. You had crosses burning on the hills around town, all around this. but the flood, yeah, David McCullough's book. I met David McCullough years ago, and it was right after The Island Center of the World came out, and so it was great getting to meet him. And I remember that he advised me to write biography, and I just don't think I have the stamina to do that. But I told him that, the Johnstown Flood was such a great inspiration, and it was just so wonderful being from the town, because he's from Pittsburgh, and having that written by one of the masters of historical nonfiction.
Absolutely. So someone asks, how did you become a writer? When did you know you wanted to write, and what was the first thing you wrote? Or that could be the first thing you published, if you want to take it that way.
Yeah, I think I always wanted to be a writer, but didn't know how you officially did it. I knew I didn't want to study writing in college. I thought, what you should do is like be a dishwasher and be a plumber and do all these, gain life experiences, and then you just start crafting. So I didn't do anything as glamorous as that. But after college, I did a lot of traveling. Traveled all over the world, lived in Japan. And then I started writing travel articles, and eventually got a couple published. And I got some published in GQ, and then I started to write other things for GQ. And there was a period of time where I wrote several children's books. So it was like anything you can do to make a living, and so that I can make a living as a writer. And then it was actually at the time, Art Cooper was the editor of GQ, and I told him that I was interested in writing an article about a group of biblical scholars in California, kind of a left-wing group of biblical scholars. And I explained why I thought it was such a cool topic, and he said, okay. And he's long gone, but I have very fond memories of Art Cooper, because GQ is not a forum in which an editor would normally say, yeah, write about, biblical scholarship. But he let me do it. He published it. And that became, then I turned that into my first book, which was called Gospel Truth, which was, for a couple of decades, biblical scholars had been writing these massive studies into the historical Jesus, the Jesus of history as opposed to the Jesus of faith. And so I thought it would be worthwhile to do kind of a journalistic overview. And what I kind of concluded was, you get all these different portraits of the historical Jesus, but they all kind of, in a way, mirror the person who's writing it. And so what I try to do is look at where they overlapped. People at the right side of the spectrum and the left side of the spectrum can all kind of agree on these basic points about who this first century Palestinian Jew was. So that was my first book. And after that, then I wrote another and another and another.
That's great. I'm so tickled you mentioned that, because that was Gospel Truth was a big book for me in college, where I was in fact studying biblical history. That was these many years ago now, but that's a particularly neat one if anybody has an interest in that subject matter, a little different from what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Cool book. Someone asked, how did you then become interested in Amsterdam and in the Dutch influence in New York? Because obviously that's been a huge part of your writing career.
Yeah, my books are varied in subject, but I think what they have in common is I have this tendency to try to pull things back to their origins. What was the origin of? And so with Gospel Truth, it was because I was raised Catholic, and then I had kind of left it, and that was a way for me to come back at that material in an intellectual sense. That was, so that was an origin story. Well, then I was living in New York City, and New York's origins, of course, are New Amsterdam. And I was talking to people. I talked to several friends in New York who were historians of New York, and I asked them about the Dutch period, and I was surprised at how little historians of New York knew about the Dutch period. And then eventually somebody said, you should talk to this guy in Albany named Charles Gehring. And so I did, and he was the head and still is the head of something called it was then called the New Netherland Project. It's now the New Netherland Research Center, and there's an affiliate organization, the New Netherland Institute, which translates and publishes the records of the colony of New Netherland, of which the capital was New Amsterdam. And I got to know him, and I was utterly fascinated by these 12,000 pages of documents and this whole society that we didn't know about. And this was a whole complex society that wasn't, on a field in Kansas or something. It was Manhattan, and I was just so amazed by that discrepancy. And so I ended up writing a book, The Island at the Center of the World, about that. And then that eventually, origins. I wanted to know the origins of that. Well, who were the Dutch? Why were the Dutch the way they were? And by this time I was living in Amsterdam. So I wrote a history of Amsterdam, which in a way is a history of the Netherlands.
Huh. So they're sort of complementary books in a way, or at least in terms of your generating them. Yeah.
Yeah, those two books, you mean? Yeah, that's right.
Great. So I think we can kind of move toward closing. If anyone else has got a question to toss in the chat, that's great. I have two more things we could, thank you. That's exactly what I was going to say. The question at hand is, and what are you working on next, if you feel like sharing it with us?
Well,
but
it's
also,
actually,
go ahead.
It picks up right from what you were just saying. I've stayed connected with the New Netherland Institute and Charlie Gehring and his work, and Charlie is still at it, still translating. And the material that he has translated in recent years really bears on the moment of the English takeover in 1664. And he and I have talked over the years about that material and what its import is and where it's heading and what that society was at that moment. And so that's going to be my next book. It'll be kind of a sequel to The Island at the Center of the World, but really focused on the takeover of Manhattan. Yeah.
That sounds fantastic and very much like something we at the library will be interested in when it appears. So is there anything that we haven't touched on in this talk that you would like to throw in related to Smalltime, related to the family history writing?
I just thank you for giving me the opportunity. Thank you all for tuning in. It's not, as we were saying before we started up, it's not the same doing a book launch via Zoom or Demio. It's better than nothing, though. But I really miss that face-to-face interaction. But thank you all for tuning in and listening to me. And I have a website, which is my name. Anyone can feel free to contact me with questions or tell me what you thought of the book.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Russell Shorto. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks so much, Sarah. Bye.